excited to welcome Gus and Chuck. Gus Speth is Dean of Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, professor in the, is that not right?
Was.
You're making faces. Was. I'm very sorry for any mistakes. It's all mine.
I'm total past tense.
Total past tense. Sorry, I'll try to edit as I go. Past tense. He was founder and president of the World Resources Institute, professor of law at Georgetown, chairman of the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality, and senior attorney and co-founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Gus has also been deeply involved in a number of projects for the United Nations. His books include Red Sky at Morning, America and the Crisis of Global Environment, Worlds Apart, Globalization and the Environment, and They Knew, the U.S. federal government's 50-year role in causing the climate crisis. Chuck Collins is a campaigner and storyteller who has worked for decades on environmental and economic justice campaigns. He is the director of the Program on Inequality and the Common Good Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. He is the author of many books, including The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions, Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good, and with Bill Gates Sr., Wealth and Our Commonwealth. And now, a novel, Altar to an Erupting Sun. Join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Well, it's good to see all of you. And thank you for coming out to hear from Chuck and about his wonderful book. Let me just add a note to the introduction of Chuck. He's a good friend, so I'm biased. But when I had an opportunity to organize some essays on critical subjects for this NGO that I work with sometimes, we wanted one on inequality in America and what to do about it. And a subject that people like Ralph Fine and others have taught at OSHA. I think I turned to the person that I thought knew the most about it and would do the best job. And I asked Chuck if he would do the essay, and he generously agreed to do it. And it's still, I think, an excellent synthesis of what the problem is and how to address it. He's a leading authority in our country on inequality. He's done a great deal with working with a lot of the very wealthy people in the country to get them to behave correctly, and a lot of them have signed up in patriotic millionaires and other groups that have been trying to devote their resources and cajole others in devoting their resources into some important projects. And the list goes on like that. In the recent book, The Hoarders, you can imagine what they're hoarding. So I think we're delighted and really honored to have Chuck here. I have a little bit I want to say about the book to kick it off. Well, I should also mention that he has a farm down in Guilford, Vermont, and homesteading down there. I made a note here, Red Sox fan. I thought that would be very endearing to the
Hope that isn't too divisive.
No, we're above the Yankee line. Yes, well, that's another story. So let me make some comments that Chuck may agree with. I found this to be a totally arresting novel. And I don't mean arresting just in the sense that me and Antal got arrested protesting the climate issue some years ago. But it's a powerful and thought-provoking book. It pulls no punches. At one time, Chuck tried to make people think it was beach reading. That was at the beginning of the summer. But it's not an idle frolic, I'll tell you that. It's the real deal. In the very opening pages of this demanding book, Chuck's protagonist, Rae, carries out a terrorist act. It's not the last thing that happens in the book, it's the first thing that happens in the book. It's a murder-suicide wiping out a top oil executive and part of his family. And the book is Rae's story, in a way, of getting to that point. And so I think what Chuck does in the book, to me, is to force us to confront two critical issues, both of them emerging from the current climate catastrophe. The first is that he has Rae ask us, everybody, really, if you think what I did was murder, what would you do to be more effective at this juncture? And that's her challenge, and in a way Chuck's challenge to us today. And it's a question that we all ought to be facing. With so much failure behind us, what do we do now? The second big issue and question that is posed by the book is that when you think about it, the climate story has increasingly visible victims and villains. And surely the villains have got to be held accountable in some way. And this theme of accountability runs through the book. And Rae, the protagonist, says in the book, and I think Chuck means in the book, that the major villains, among the major villains, are the top leadership of our giant fossil fuel companies and the industry. And so the question is, how do we actually hold them accountable for what is going on? And that's a huge question for us to deal with. So there. As I've said, I really don't think it's beach reading, despite the efforts to try to get everyone to read it at the beach. But I would say this also, that Chuck presents all this in an endearing, charming, graceful way that makes reading this book, despite its agonizing questions, makes reading this book an honest pleasure. And I enjoyed it. Cameron enjoyed it after I suggested that she read it too. So we are here to not only welcome Chuck, but to thank you. Take it over.
Wow, thank you. Well, you can see why I hired him to come and open the program, but thanks to Norwich Bookstore, just a couple gratitudes. Thank you for, and support as Andy said, thank you for supporting an independent bookstore. And I've gotten a chance to visit a bunch of independent bookstores around New England in these conversations, and it's been a pleasure. And then, there's specific people here. A friend of mine, Dakota Butterfield, she doesn't quite fully understand how influential she is in this book, but when she gets done with it, she will. So thank you for being here, Dakota, and thanks to Gus and Cameron. And I'll say a little bit about the book. I think Gus kind of gave you a pretty good. There's no spoiler alert there. The Rae's facing down. She only has months to live, and at the end makes this decision to go out, taking a fossil fuel executive who she believes is responsible for delaying society's response to the climate change.
Oh, really?
And because she read They Knew. She actually, in the book, reads They Knew. So,
interlocking directorate.
yeah, you can see it's insidious, really, yeah. I think there's something curious about the fact that our first scheduled event for this in early July was maybe the only event I've ever been flooded out. We were all going to be gathering in early July. And we've had, here in our brave little state of Vermont, we're it's hard to go out and, kids' soccer games being canceled because of smoke. And so we're kind of experiencing this moment that this impossible news of what does it mean to live in a disrupted future. And yeah, my hope in this book was to write a book that would actually be a good story. There are friends of mine who read it at the beach, and more in the context of saying, I never would have read any of your other books at the beach, but maybe this one counts, So trying to write fiction for somebody who hasn't written fiction before, but was a real pleasure, and I got a lot of help, a lot of readers along the way. But my hope was to, in the tradition sort of Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler and others, like, fiction is a way we can imagine what the future might look like. So the book really starts off with Rae's sort of shocking action. Then it jumps ahead 7 years, and that's, in a kind of genre-defining way. I like that there's a little over here, genre-defining books corner. That's where I want to be over there. Because some people are like, well, this is future fiction. So yeah, there's an element of imagining, dramatizing what happens as a result of Rae's shocking action, her provocation. What blowback, what repression, the criminalization of dissent. All these things happen in the 7 years after her action. But there's also some laser focus on the role of the fossil fuel industry. And this conversation about who, as Gus so eloquently said, who's sort of responsible for the moment we're in. Well, of course, Rae and I would say we're all responsible to some extent for, particularly those of us in the global north and who have benefited from a century of burning fossil fuel and the lifestyle and infrastructure that we benefit from. At the same time, at the end of Rae's life, she becomes, because she read They Knew, and she read a lot of the sort of research about the moment we're in, she kind of understands that there's an industry that's known 40, 50 years now what the impact of burning greenhouse gases would be, and they use their considerable power to sow misinformation, disseminate disinformation, sow doubt, block alternatives, and delay. And to the point where now we're kind of up against the wall, is a friendly way to say it. So that really is and her belief is that this is a Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the earth. And so she's kind of an autodidactic. She's, if she lived here in Norwich, she would probably have part of her paycheck taken out here at the Norwich Bookstore. She's a reader. Between the library and bookstore, she's consuming a lot and learning a lot. And she really digs in and studies the moment that we're in. So we look forward 7 years, but 7 years later, Reggie, her husband, and Alex, her kind of adopted daughter, are all gathering, and they say, why did Rae do this? Here's somebody who is a lifelong activist, a lifelong nonviolent trainer. She's involved in teaching people about the skills and approach to nonviolence. How did somebody with those elders that she had, why did she come to this conclusion? And so that's the historical fiction part of it, which is really starting in 1973. What were the social movements, the people, the books that shaped Rae Kelliher, this character, her formation? It's a formation story. And I don't know a lot of books that sort of have a depiction of a lifelong community organizer, community activist who isn't annoying. There's very few to start with. There's occasionally a reference to the organizer, agitator in the room. It's the person you sidle away from, at the coffee hour or whatever. In the case of Rae, I think she's kind of the life of the party. And I want to just read a little snippet to introduce you to Rae. But so anyway, I think Gus set up the conversation perfectly in terms of what we would love to talk to you about, which is, how do we make sense of the moment we're in, and how do we make sense of the fact that there's this rogue industry that has effectively run out the clock, and how do we engage around that? But let me start by just introducing you to Rae Kelliher, who was raised working class, first person in her family to go to college, goes to Amherst College and drops out her second year, which is high stakes for her and her family. And this is Reggie, her husband of 36 years. 7 years after her action, there's kind of a birthday party for her, and people are gathering at their farm in southern Vermont, and he's trying to think about offering some reflections on why she did what she did, and that's kind of how it sets up. But so this is Reggie. He says, what can he say about Rae that he hasn't already said before? Each year that goes by validates everything she predicted. She was prescient, a channeler, a manifester. She could see things that other people didn't see. She said he had that power too, if he wanted to tap into it. He was going to lose her either way, either to the cancer that had metastasized through her body, or her decision to go out with a violent bang. She could have ended her life here at Hidden River Farm, surrounded by loved ones. People could have sung songs to her as she had done with so many others who had passed before. She could have gone gently to the other side, but no, not Rae. She was fueled by love, music, dancing, and rage, an anger so slow burn that it was chilling. Cold anger, as Reggie's old organizing friend Ernesto Ernie Cortez used to say, was what you looked for in a leader. The hot anger types would flame out, act impulsively, turn off allies. The cold anger types could strategize, build alliances, think long-term, and persist. It was Rae who convened the hospice and green burial ministry here at the Hidden River Farm. Many days he listened to her talk energetically about conscious dying, not letting the medical industry and the funeral profiteers get their talons into you. We need to speak about death, face it, accept it as part of the great cycle. She loved to point out the various death practices from indigenous and other cultures from around the world. We have so much to learn from these other traditions. Reggie thinks about how every March, Rae enlisted him to join the salamander crossing teams that gathered along the roadways after the first warm spring rain. Do you have any salamander crossing brigades here? Yeah, a couple, okay. Yeah, down our way, that first March, warm night in March when it starts to rain, all the salamanders are coming down to their vernal pools, and there's a group of people who anyway, you get the idea. Wearing reflective vests and holding flashlights, they make sure the frogs and salamanders, eager to attend wild spawning orgies in the vernal pools, make it across the road alive. Salamander protection required staying up to 11 p.m., several hours past Quaker midnight in Reggie's book. But nothing could deflate Rae more than holding a squished wood frog in her hand, knowing she could have saved a life. So he happily joined the crossing guards. Save a life, take a life. Rae's reverence for life was consistent until her final minutes. And yet, so that gives you a little bit of sense of Rae. And one of the things that she is a death doula. And, there's part of what I try to do in this book, in addition to the big questions that Gus offers, is what does it look like to form a community to face this disrupted future? What do we need to do at the kind of local level where we have some agency? And so I was sort of drawing from Windham County and people up here, and there's a lot of activity here, and it was kind of fun to imagine how could that evolve over the next 7 years. So part of what this story is about is also, how do we prepare? How do we live? And in Rae and the community that they form, it's not exactly a commune, but it's people living in proximity to each other, sharing a lot, sharing meals, growing food, trying to figure out how to organize livelihoods. But there's several threads that I'll just mention. How do we welcome newcomers? Welcome the climate refugees and the political refugees that will come to this region, assuming our kind of lottery might be not just flooding, but a regional resilience. How do we practice mutual aid? How do we get to know our neighbors and support one another? How do we think about the final years and death and dying and conscious dying and dying with dignity and the sort of creating a new culture around that. And again, Rae would say, we're not going to really be able to face the future if we have this kind of death-phobic way of not talking with one another about what the end looks like. There's culture, celebration. And Rae, one of the things that she really embodies is we need to create a culture of celebration, a culture of life, parties. She's like the person who remembers your birthday, who remembers the moon holidays. She would have organized the blue supermoon party last night, everybody out watching the moon. That's kind of the Rae Kelliher, but that's part of this reweaving a kind of connected and resilient culture that will help us deal with the disruptions that are to come. So that's a really part of the storytelling that I'm trying to do, is imagining what that looks like.
And she likes altars.
Yes, so so I actually brought a little mini altar. But yeah, as Gus says, Rae is a altar builder, and she learns that from people. Now you're familiar with sort of Day of the Dead and that tradition, those altars. But turns out many cultures, including my Irish culture, there's the Samhain, there's in Vietnam. She learns from a guy named Brian Wilson. There's some real people who show up in this book. There's a guy named Sam Lovejoy that some of you may have heard of, who toppled in 1975 or so, toppled a tower in opposition to nuclear power. Sam Lovejoy is a character in this book. Brian Wilson is a character. He's a Vietnam vet who lived in Greenfield. When I knew him, he was obsessed with this guy Norman Morrison, who's here on the altar. Norman Morrison was a Quaker who self-immolated himself outside of Robert McNamara's office in 1965. And Brian, shipping out to Vietnam, says, what a nutter, but 3 years later in Vietnam, he's like soured to the mission, and he's doing his reconnaissance. His job is to go into these villages after the U.S. bombing, and he goes into a village, and everyone is gone. But in a hut, there's an altar, a Vietnamese remembrance altar, an ancestor altar. And on that altar are pictures of this family's elders, and there's a picture of Norman Morrison, a U.S. Quaker who, in the tradition of the Vietnamese monks, self-immolated himself. So Rae she does spend some time in Central America, where she's invited into people's sort of private altars. While they're actively mourning. And so she learns altars are how we honor those who've come before, as well as prepare and draw strength from our ancestors. So she becomes a big weaver of public altars. Let's build a community altar as well as a private altar. So that the role of altars is one of those threads. And some of the people who've read this novel said, "Oh, my takeaway is, I'm going to start building altars, or I already have an altar, but I'm going to deepen my altar practice." So, anyway, those are a couple initial thoughts.
Yeah, well, that's a great kickoff. Thank you. And I'm just curious, Chuck, when you made a pivot to fiction after writing a whole series of really great nonfiction books. What did you think the fiction would add to what you could say just in another nonfiction book that really went after this problem?
Well, I don't know about you, but I find fiction is kind of a more liberating space to imagine. And in the case of trying to imagine the future, you can imagine how the future might unfold. Not in a sort of zombie apocalypse or, way, but actually, my hope was to depict people actually getting organized to face the future, to live in harmony with each other and the earth, So in that case, in that sense, I was, and it was liberating, actually. I mean, Gus, God, look at all the footnotes he has to keeping it. Think about how liberating. That's why he's writing poetry now. No footnotes, you know. I mean, so there's that practical. But to be honest, you know, actually, my wife Mary's here, who is a great storyteller. She does kind of like the moth storytelling. I convinced her to come tonight because the King Arthur flower is. We could stop there on the way, and she's about to enter the Guilford Fair baking competition, so she needed to get some ingredients this weekend, right? So, and by the way, she won the blue ribbon at the Tunbridge World's Fair 2 years ago, so anyway, so she's a storyteller. And she, about 10 years ago, said, you know, these books you're writing are great. Of course, no one's reading them. Have you thought about incorporating some narrative elements into it? And that, she got me into storytelling, and I've tried in the nonfiction space to be a better storyteller, narrative writing. So I think part of it is writing something that someone might want to read. Seems like a crazy idea, but for a writer. So yeah. So I think poetry and fiction. Here we are.
Well, one of the things that Chuck does in the book and does so well is, as he mentioned, is to weave into the story these real people and real events. Historical accuracy, I presume, you strove for, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that in there, and of course a lot of it has to do with U.S. depredations around the world, and Rae going to these places and seeing what was really going on the ground, and I presume a lot of that you did it that way, Chuck, in order to enhance the sense of accuracy of the whole story. I mean, it seems to me that dealing with these real people and real circumstances adds credibility to the fictional part of the book. But maybe you had some other reason for going there.
No, it's a great question. You know, in a way, the book is an altar to people that have and social movements that have come before, and it is a formation story in the classic sense of what forms us. And again, I find historical fiction really enlivening. It kind of is the gateway for wanting to learn more about something. You know, I read a novel set in Turkey, all of a sudden I want to learn history, and I'm kind of hooked. I do have a younger reader audience in mind as well, who maybe didn't live through some of those, but both to celebrate the people who lived through those movements, of which there are some of you can see yourself or will see yourselves in the story, as well as telling. You know, I told you the Brian Wilson story about Norman Morrison and the impact on him. I wanted to kind of lift up some real little historical bits in it, and while I didn't do footnotes, I do have a section of my writer's website where if you want to learn all the history, it's all kind of linked in there. We want to see the video about Sam Lovejoy toppling the tower, or you want to know who Juanita and Wally Nelson were, the civil rights activists and war tax resistors. You know, there's things there to learn more. So, you know, being a campaigner or organizer, always got an agenda. You know, I can't just relax and, write pure fiction or whatever without an agenda. So, yeah, part of my desire is to lift up these stories in the way that I would put them on the altar. So here's Wally and Juanita on the altar, and the garlic that grows on their homestead still, and actually, Gus, you mentioned Rae goes, like a lot of people in the 80s. She went to Central America. She didn't go for a long time. She went for like 6 months. She worked in Mexico. She worked in a refugee camp in El Salvador. She picked cotton and coffee in Nicaragua, in opposition to U.S. foreign policy. That's where she kind of got her global picture. The role of U.S. foreign policy in the world, the role of our sort of hyper-consumption compared to other places in the world. And there's a point in the book where she is in this refugee camp in El Salvador, and she's kind of getting oriented, and the Lutheran volunteer says to her, well, we really look forward to Egg Day here. And Rae's like, Egg Day? Mm-hmm. She says, yeah, everybody gets an egg. And Rae says, one egg? Mm-hmm. She says, well, there's 4,000 people here who live here. She's like, oh. And then she starts to look forward to Egg Day. Mm-hmm. So I actually have a photo from the Batania refugee camp that I took of Egg Day. So even though I haven't lived in El Salvador, 40 years later, I think about Egg Day. It's just one of those things. So that's part of what forms and imprints on Rae as a character that gives her that kind of global understanding of the justice issues that she's wrestling with.
Now, Chuck, you mentioned you took this photograph. I think, I wonder, I'm thinking about how autobiographical is this story? Because a lot of it is set in places where you have been, in Jamaica Plains, in western Massachusetts, in Guilford area, down in the Pioneer Valley. And I don't think you're a character in this story. I haven't found you in the story, but you were always there. You were always at these places. You were with all these people. I mean, and that's great writing. But how accurate is that statement that I just made?
Yeah, I mean, you have to write what you know. You have to draw. I don't have any other life experience to draw on. That said, there's quite a bit that I wasn't part of. I was a little young to be part of the Clamshell Alliance, trying to stop Seabrook from being built. I was 17. But some of my, and I say elders, but I'm talking about people like Dakota who are only like, half a decade older than me, or, 10 years older in some cases. They were very involved. So I wanted to kind of learn, so I did have to do my homework and learn some of those things. The pieces in Central America are among the more autobiographical. There's some experiences there I had, like there's a scene where Rae shows up in Mexico City after the earthquake. She's on her way to language school. She has no skills, but she plugs into a soup kitchen after this horrific earthquake in 1985. That's maybe the most autobiographical moment of the book, because I really did cut 3,000 onions at the soup kitchen, to the point where people would sidle away from me because I just smelled like an onion. So that little moment is among the more autobiographical. But it's really a work of fiction, and I really interviewed or talked to people who had lived through some of these other chapters. But it is an altar too to people, some people I knew and some people who I wanted to lift up and tell their stories.
So you mentioned Bonhoeffer just a second ago, and Bonhoeffer is featured prominently in the book, I would say. What's the relevance of Bonhoeffer to the gist of the book?
Well, I think that in like Bonhoeffer, Rae Kelliher, my fictional Rae Kelliher, is a pacifist. I mean, she really believes in nonviolence. Bonhoeffer was a eloquent pacifist, and yet he joined a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler, ultimately was executed for that action. And so Rae is steeped, like a lot of things. She kind of goes on one of her learning binges and watches. There's a great documentary about Bonhoeffer. She tries to read some of the primary texts, which are not that easy, but she kind of becomes, as I said at the beginning, she believes, she develops a concept of evil, that there are people who are acting with a malice and evil. And again, this is not, I'm differentiating between me and a fictional character. She comes to believe that the leaders of these fossil fuel companies really belong in the lowest rung or lowest ring of hell, because they are like essentially poisoning the village well, knowing that children will be drinking from the well. And so, like Bonhoeffer, she has to ask herself, she wrestles with what do you do with that? And how do you hold people accountable? So it's an extreme action, but she believes it is a Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the Earth. That there's a need for dramatic action, and there are, authors' prerogatives. The book starts on April 9th, 2023. That's when it's Easter. That was Easter this year. That is when Rae takes her action. That is also the anniversary of Bonhoeffer's execution. So she knows that. She knows that. She's like the keeper of the calendar. And that's part of the provocation. Have we come to the Bonhoeffer moment?
Wow. Okay. Now, a lot of good things come of Rae's action in the book. A lot of negative things happen too, but and some interesting things happen, like the oil barons all getting security to accompany them around all the time. But what do what do we make of good things coming of a murder?
Yeah, I wouldn't say good things happen, but the reality is Rae's action focuses people's attention in a way that is dramatic and hard to ignore. There are also, in the future fiction part of the story, there are copycats. There are people who also are terminally ill who engage in action that are inspired by Rae. In one case, there are 6 grandmothers who are terminally ill and do essentially a Norman Morrison self-immolation in the lobby of ExxonMobil. That is actually the tipping point. That is the moment at which people put down their phones and stop talking about what Kim Kardashian is having for lunch and start to say, why would they do this? And why are they so aggrieved with the fossil fuel industry? And they do it in a public way with a statement and a witness. So I think, and there's this, there's a point in the book, I won't read it, but I'll just say there's a point where Rae says to her husband Reggie, she knows she's very ill. He knows she's a death doula, and she says, this is how I want to end my life. And he says, this is a terrible idea. They disagree. And he convinces her to have a Quaker clearness, to sort of get 4 people together and sort of have it out. And that is depicted in the story. And at which point he says to her, well, what about a Norman Morrison action? If you're feeling called in this way, why commit murder? Murder will just, it doesn't, and I think the story shows that the backlash is considerable. But that her beginning a process of escalation of tactics is what she intended to do. She wants to be provocative. She wants people to pay attention. She wants people to do something dramatic. And in that sense, weaving into our conversation together, I sort of believe we do need some form of dramatic action, not murder groups, but bold witness, disruption, things that kind of focus people's attention, particularly on the role of the fossil fuel industry, who have gotten a huge, what would it look like? And this is actually maybe a question for you, Gus. I mean, what would it look like? And I should say, if people don't know, this was a brief that was written for the Children's Trust in a lawsuit. And we can celebrate, I'm glad we're meeting after the Montana decision, because the Montana decision was a Children's Trust case. A lot of the evidence that Gus assembled here, it was part of that case. So where are the pressure points? and how do we kind of keep that laser focus? Because now that people are waking up to the fact that the smoke is in our eyes and the floods, and there's a whole bunch of solutions being put forward. If you read Bill Gates's book about climate change, it's all about how do we build a bigger sponge. Okay, so the bathtub is overflowing, and everybody's talking about how do we build a bigger sponge, as opposed to how do we turn off the faucet. Because turning off the faucet means taking a look at some deeper systemic issues in it, including the role of the fossil fuel industry. So let's figure out carbon capture, and let's develop, let's do agriculture and draw down carbon and create larger sinks. When in fact what Rae would say is, well, what about the faucet? So I kind of want to bounce it back to you in terms of the moment we're in. And
Well, there are two things going on. I think one thing that's going on and one thing that's not going on, in my thinking. One thing that's going on is that there are a proliferation of lawsuits of a different type than the one that the children are bringing, which is really to force government action. But there are a proliferation of lawsuits against the big fossil giants. Mostly brought by cities and states that have suffered from climate disasters, and those suits were paused really for a long time, as there was a debate about whether they could go forward in the state and local courts. And have you heard this one before? They kept trying to transfer it into federal courts, and finally they lost that. And now these cases are ready to go forward, I hope, for a lot of decisions. So one way to make these barons pay is to make them pay, quite literally, for the damages. And we're all going to get stuck for a huge price tag for what they have done. For example, in the international negotiations, there's a loss and damage component to those negotiations, where the rest of the world is saying, we have suffered tremendous damages already. Who is going to compensate us for those damages? Well, it turns out that it looks like it's governments, but it's not the companies themselves directly yet. So to make those connections and make these great companies pay for what they have done, I think is extremely important. The other thing that could happen, but it doesn't seem to me is happening, is to identify the leaders of these companies, the people who've really made the decisions, and call them out. Shame and blame. And we haven't really gone there, and we don't want to go there with murders or anything, or any kind of violence, but we do want to go there with perhaps a lot of disruption. That is a shame and blame thing. I saw a really great shame and blame thing at Yale one time. The Coca-Cola company was blamed for a lot of bad behavior in South America, Central America, and the head of the Coca-Cola company, a man named Daft, interestingly, came to Yale to make a presentation, and it was the weirdest thing. I want you to know it was really weird. He insisted on having these, those galvanized buckets full of ice with the Cokes sticking in out of the ice. He insisted on having them all over the campus, so Yale did this. But he came to make his big address at the university, and he started up, and he was very stilted, I thought, but he was going forward. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of students got up, walked down towards where he was, laid down and poured blood all over themselves, or fake blood, right there, in front of everybody. And Lynn Daft just kept reading away as if nothing had happened. But, he was shamed at that moment. The company was shamed for what they had allegedly done. And I think, to get active on that front is important, to call out these people as individuals. And so far they've escaped attention and gone into big fat retirements. As I presume Mr. Tillerson is now. But I have two last questions real quick, and maybe we'll throw it open then to whatever's on your minds. One thing was that a question, have any of the fossil barons read your book and written you anything about it?
Quick answer, no. I'm hoping the book will get banned. How do you get your book banned?
All right.
I guess it has to be, in a classroom somewhere, and then it'll get banned. But
The second question is not a question. Well, it is a question for you to comment on. You mentioned in the book that that if you look into the more distant future, that maybe it's Rae who says this, but there's the idea that the Amish are really better prepared for the future that's coming, than most of us are. Would you comment on that? Because you don't elaborate it in the book, but I thought it was very interesting.
yeah, actually, a part of the future fiction is and basically imagine the Amish community that's settled in the Northeast Kingdom. A lot of the Amish are moving away from Pennsylvania Dutch. The traffic is too much, the development and cost of land. It's a very sizable new community forming in the Northeast Kingdom, and imagining that happening all over the sort of northern tier of New England. So I think that's happening. The northern Adirondacks, northern Vermont, and they are have that combination of community and skills and the ability to sort of pull together and face the future. So in my future fiction, there's more exchange and interactions between the Amish and some of the new climate refugees coming to this region. That 10 years from now, Vermont's going to look different. There's going to be, the population is going to grow. I think as Gus Seelig from the Housing Trust says, the first climate refugees are the affluent and the wealthy, but then we're going to start to see people who are not so affluent and wealthy. And how do we respond and welcome the strangers to this area? So that was part of the vision, the future vision that I kind of imagine in the next decade.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Now, we'll throw the floor open for any questions, speeches, observations that anybody wants to make. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
This model of a person becoming so violent is really quite disturbing, especially when you also go on to suggest that other people then start considering this as a model. That group is not only those who agree with you politically. Potentially, it's your opposition using the same tactics. This is a very disturbing suggestion.
So the question is, this is a disturbing inference, and there are people who are also contemplating violence, right-wing violence, etc. Yeah, no, I think that's one of the legitimacy of violence as a tactic is a problem. I mean, and I think there's a fair amount of, I try to show in the story just how harmful that is. And it actually harms her own family. Her own sort of adopted daughter has to go to prison for just driving her to where her final act. So, yeah, it's not at all to validate. It's just, partly I should say, it's in people's minds. It's in the chatter. I hear people say, if I were terminally ill, I would consider this. And so part of it was in using fiction was to explore what would be the blowback of that. And the copycat actions are not necessarily other murders. They're other escalations of tactics. I should say, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. There's a new book, The Deluge by Stephen Markley, I think it is. All are kind of in the same thematic. Like, we basically are hitting a moment where our political system is incapable of responding to the challenge. So we have this impasse, and people are going to feel powerlessness. And I'm just going to say, you're going to see a lot more disruption of, there's a group of young people, Climate Defiance. They are showing up. They went to Governor Maura Healey's fundraiser in Nantucket because she has not pledged to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure in Massachusetts. They disrupted her soiree on Nantucket. Now, a lot of people are upset by that. But these are younger people who are saying, we need to draw attention to your inaction and your failure. I think we're going to see over the next couple of years an escalation of tactics. Hopefully not along these lines, but property destruction. There's a lot of people who are going to try to stop new fossil fuel infrastructure from being built through nonviolent direct action, but they're still going to be disrupting that. Down more my end of New England, there's a plan to expand Hanscom Field, the airport in Concord, Massachusetts, so it can quadruple its private jet capacity. They already are the biggest private jet terminal, airport in New England. They need 400% increase in their capacity so the super rich can fly to Nantucket as opposed to take a ferry. People are not going to stand by and let that happen. So even if they get rolled on a regulatory process, there are hundreds of people preparing now to resist the expansion of that airport. So I think we should buckle up because we're heading into tough times, and some of that will be in terms of the response. And you may not like what you see, but it's a reflection of the powerlessness.
This group, Climate Defiance, is committed as one of its principles to nonviolence. And I think, my impression is that they're serious about it. They were the group that launched the demonstration at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you may remember. That got a certain amount of attention, and so they're getting attention to the urgency of the issue. You've got to give them that, and if they stick to the nonviolence, I think they'll become an interesting force. You had your hand up, sir. Mr. Fine.
Yeah, I don't know whether I can ask this the right way, but in terms of...
Give it a try.
In terms of envisioning the future, do you deal in this with the population and how it deals with it, not in terms of tactics or whatnot? But it just strikes me that either people are going to have to, either there's going to have to be technology or something that causes one not to need fossil fuels the way you have, or there's going to have to be some substitute that continues to give people the lifestyle and the wealth and whatever that they become accustomed to. Does that enter into this at all?
Very much, very much. And in the case of Rae Kelliher, she doesn't, and the community that they form, they kind of basically are in the we need to power down camp. We're not going to just unplug the fossil fuels and plug in the electric, renewables. There's, for a variety of energy and other reasons, that's not going to be possible. Our life, we are heading into a change. The next 20 years are not going to be like the last 60 years. And so she believes we're heading into a transition, a deep transition in terms of our energy consumption. And that's necessary, particularly those of us in the global north, from a kind of global equity point of view. So yeah, part of the vision is imagining what would a degrowth future look like, or a steady state economy, or whatever palatable phrase you want to use. We're not going to basically be extracting and burning coal, oil, and gas. We can't at the level we are now. So it's going to be a powering down, and so that's part of imagining, part of the vision here. Now, a lot of people aren't going to like that. They're going to be like, "Hey, we'll suck all the bad carbon out of the air, and we can keep driving. We can do whatever we want. We can keep living the way we want." I just don't think that's possible.
So you've got this side of the equation, the demand side and the demand side reduction. On the alternative side that Ralph is raising, what has happened is that we now have years of exponential growth in the renewables. It is really quite phenomenal what is happening. And this Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, is spurring that on. And we should thank the administration for that. It's really a huge breakthrough. And the result of things that are happening in Europe, for example, is, I believe this is an accurate statistic, because I read it today, of course, and Europe is down to the point where only a third of their electricity is produced with fossil fuels. So 2/3 of the electric power in Europe is coming from I think some nuclear, but increasingly renewable, wind and solar. That's huge. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, they're on the verge of a period where they're going to free their electricity sector from the fossil industry. A point in the back, please. Yes.
Hi, Chuck. I was wondering if you could talk about the continuities as you see them between your previous books, which are sort of autobiographical nonfiction, like The Wealth Hoarders and Born on Third Base, and this new venture into fiction.
Well, the question is there a continuity between previous nonfiction books I've written and this novel? And I would say yes and no. Mostly, as Gus said, I focused on issues of wealth inequality. I kind of think of them as the twin interconnected part of the poly crisis, if you will. There's the ecological, the economic, democracy, like we're sort of heading into, deep shift in all of those areas. I think I'm still very, in my day job, if you will, I'm still very involved in where are the wealthy hiding their money? How do we reform trusts? That's kind of the wealth of the commons that we could be deploying to sort of help with the transition to a green future that's kind of being sequestered. So I do see them connected in that way, but this is less a book about extreme wealth inequality and more a book about how do we prepare for an ecologically disrupted future. But they're all interconnected in my mind. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
One other contributor to global warming is war.
Yeah.
And war uses a lot of fossil fuel. And I think, and nuclear weapons as well. I mean, I think that there has to be a connection. The United States has more than 800 foreign bases ready to, help whoever needs it. And we have our military everywhere in the world. So, I don't think it's just the fossil fuel. Right? And, the defense industry is making a killing because of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's making the climate worse.
Yeah, I think we didn't talk really enough about sort of the role of militarism and war in this equation. Rae is somebody who's shaped by U.S. foreign policy in Central America and the School of Americas where they're training, dictators, and she would say amen to what you just said. And one thing I would just lift up, though, is the extraordinary role of the fossil fuel industry. We could talk about the military contractors in the same way. The parallel is both these industries have sort of captured our political system. If you go back and look, as I have, at the role of the fossil fuel industry, starting in the 1930s in Texas, they are the single greatest funder of regressive politics. The early Texas wildcat billionaires, they were like the John Birch Society, the most extreme right-wing, and now Sheldon Whitehouse did these hearings earlier in the summer, the senator from Rhode Island, looking at the role of dark money flowing from the fossil fuel industry to white supremacist and anti-democrat democracy groups. So just like kind of Saudi Arabia and extractive economies around the world, that industry is a powerful regressive force, and they've sort of carved out their subsidies and they've carved out their regulatory capture in a way that's very similar to the military-industrial complex, but is unique in other ways too. So, one of the practical things I've proposed is, like Senator Whitehouse, doing a series of hearings or a sort of tribunal on how did the fossil fuel industry use their power to block, sow misinformation, disinformation, delay, right up till today. I mean, if you think about the the deficit deal that was cut with Biden and the Republicans, they includes a new construction of a new pipeline, Joe Manchin's pipeline, in Virginia, West Virginia. So, like, they're just getting their way. And how is that going to stop? So, those of you who are here in Vermont, if you're not aware of Third Act, this is, people coming together in the, as the Mexicans say, the tercera edad, the last third. I know we don't like to face that. There's 3 stages of life, and many of us are in the last third. But, we shouldn't be looking to young people in their 20s who are just starting their lives to take the big risks. Third Act is saying, we have a role, and they're really zeroing in on the financial enablers of the fossil fuel industry, in addition to divestment and other sort of pressure points. So there's, and then I think some kind of tribunal that looks at the culpability, the shame and blame, and expose the history. Shame and blame is an old Alinsky phrase, but that's relevant as ever.
Yes.
The whole idea of escalating tactics
Yeah, so in courtesy to our hosts here, one more question. So, yeah, then we'll have a...
So in terms of escalating tactics, so I agree the importance of escalating tactics. I think of ACT UP and the gay and the HIV/AIDS movement and all of what was involved there, the disrupting forces, but then also the coalescing forces, the whole idea of the quilts, and how that raised in people's mind a whole different perspective on how they saw this and how they saw people with HIV/AIDS. And then I think the process of how you bring communities together across the horrible differences we have right now, and the idea of visioning and coming together. Okay, you have a tribunal, but you also have a moment where people come together and envision a new future that incorporates the commons and all the kinds of things that I think we care about, and how important it is to have both aspects of the escalating tactics. And I just wondered your comments on that.
Well, I think that's
The idea of the altars.
a fabulous comment. And I think part of that reweaving the culture is not just, I think we're focusing on the stop the harm,
Right.
but we have to rebuild, we have to create a new culture moving forward, a culture of connection, of celebration, of of grieving what we're losing. The quilt equivalent is this climate ribbon, where people are building these trees and writing, what is it that you don't want to lose, or what is it you're seeing you're losing winter. We're losing things, and we need to sort of create a culture around that, an altar building. So yeah, I think what is the culture of life, and how do we kind of help nurture that as part of this? So I think that's an excellent kind of closing observation, and I want to thank Gus. And
Well, let me just say in conclusion, Chuck, you've written a courageous book, a provocative book, and one that we all need to read and understand, I think. And I see Rae's actions as not as a model, but as a metaphor for what we all need to be doing at this point in the ways that we can act, because we've reached an extreme point, and it requires a change in our behavior to get this problem never really under control, but beat back to the minimum that we can still beat it back. And so thank you.
Thank you
for doing this,
Yeah.
and for challenging us and the world really. And the book, as I say, is despite its kind of a horrible beginning, is actually a great read, and a gentle, sweet story of the evolution of a person who finally reached the end of her rope.
yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And, thank you. And please, thank you, Ashley and Andy in the bookstore. Please buy the books. I'm sure Gus and I are happy to inscribe them. Think of somebody who you'd like to gift it to. Think of your favorite fossil fuel executive who might like a copy of They Knew.
This is the one. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
This is
But both books are available, and I think Gus would be willing to personalize as well. And thank you all for coming, and thanks Ashley for hosting us.